Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Jordan Sly. I'm a research and instruction librarian at the University of Maryland in College Park. I work with the departments of anthropology, psychology, philosophy, French, German, Italian, and the digital humanities. As a little bit of a kind of disclaimer preface here, I want to kind of note a couple of things from the beginning, which is that since we're all coming from different institutions, different library systems, all of this, and I actually don't know where either you are coming from exactly, we have to be a little bit general, a little bit broad in some of the topics that we're discussing, as each library has a different set of things available to them, different resources, that sort of a thing. But that's sort of okay, because a lot of the principles that I'm going to be discussing really don't need much more than a pencil and paper in order to do at sort of even the most technical, something like Excel will get you there with a lot of data presentation. We have other workshops available through the University of Maryland libraries, for example, that some of my colleagues run on things like exporting data from R or Tableau, other programs like this into a presentable format. But in this presentation, we're going to be doing a little bit more of a light touch and a little bit more of a discussion of the sort of the sort of principles of presentation in the presentation of data. Now, throughout the presentation, I'm also going to be using terms like research and data interchangeably and kind of willy-nilly. And that's because we're not going to be talking about specific data or specific research. The principles may or may not apply directly to your own work, but hopefully some of the general themes will come through and it will be understandable as we go. Okay. The purpose of this workshop is to help you think about data collection, storage, and presentation in a holistic way, to help you understand the life cycle of data that begins with the very, very beginning, with before the project even officially starts and continues even after the project has been completed. This is a beginner's workshop, and given the time constraints and difficulty of communicating very complex ideas through the video chat, we're not going to be going into huge depths into all these ideas. And additionally, as I mentioned a moment ago, because this is a multidisciplinary workshop, we need to stay somewhat vague in hopes of retaining sort of the relevance in a more broad sense. That said, however, if you have specific questions, you're more than welcome to ask when we get to that portion of the workshop. We're going to look at three elements of using data that I mentioned: collection, management, and presentation. And we're going to do this in conjunction. In other words, while it may seem like these are separate notions, I think they're actually critical to understand as a whole, as a mode of data practice, and therefore not really separable. Why? Well, by designing a project with output in mind from the very beginning, we can collect data in a usable way and avoid noise and unnecessary elements from crowding our data's story. We're going to keep coming back to this notion of sort of data story and narrative and things like that. So we want to design with purpose from the very beginning in order to clarify that story and make it come through in the most sort of clear and straightforward way. And additionally, our method of storage and organization also creates a path towards our presentation by maintaining the data's integrity and, importantly, its structure. And this provides us with the way forward in using our data in a way that ensures that the most effective communication of that data comes through. We want to make sure it's consistent and clear. If we think about these elements as a triptych, then we're going to address the furthest panel first. That is the central problem addressed by this workshop particularly. And if we run out of time, hopefully that's the most important part that we've gotten across. The way data is presented has a huge impact on the way that it is perceived. By allowing the data to tell its story through clear communication, your research will have a greater impact on your target audience. The central idea in this first section is using your data to tell a story. More to the point, to find a way to communicate your data in the most readable and understandable way. To declutter and focus your presentation and visualization on the absolute most salient points and to ensure clarity and accuracy through the way the data are laid out. For the most part, what I'm saying comes from the central tenets of two authors, Edward Tufte and Katie Bonner. And here are some of their big publications. So we'll start with Edward Tufte. These are his major publications here. You probably will have heard of some of these. This is his most sort of important in a lot of ways. This is kind of what sets the pace for a lot of discussion of data presentation in the year subsequently. But Beautiful Evidence too really makes the case for the sort of clarity and purpose and the sort of design-based thinking that can go into the presentation of data. His other books, his older ones, Visual Explanations and Envisioning Information, are both important too, but a lot of what he covers in these earlier books are covered in his later books as well. So if you were to start with one of these, I would say start with the visual display of quantitative information. Most of the University of Maryland libraries have these in some capacity. Okay. As for Katie Bonner, she has two books that are both very, very good. I would say the Atlas of Knowledge is a very interesting one and one worth looking at. What she does here is kind of like with Tufte. She gives you a full, it's like a long, it's kind of a strange shaped book, it's more like a coffee table book, but it gives you these sort of big, beautiful pictures of a lot of data and interesting and fun ways to present them. You can see even on the cover, this is one that my son particularly likes because it has Legos on it. And it's to show, I think this is the island of Manhattan and so forth. So, and it shows kind of in the larger sort of framework of it, it tells a story of the development of New York or something like this. And it does that over a course of a number of different data presentations. And so she gives you a number of different ways to display, and hers tend to be a little bit more digital, and Tufte's do tend to be a little bit more analog, and they both have their charm. And the Visual Insights, A Practical Guide to Making Sense of Data, is a very interesting book as well, but it is a little bit more sort of manual style. It's more of a sort of description of these things and how to do it. And it's really worth taking a look at if this is something that you are generally interested in. Okay. So to distill some of these central notions, some of the basic ideas from Bonner and from Tufte, we can focus on a couple of key points. First of all, data visualization is not new, but it has changed. And this can lead to more people making bad graphs. Essentially, anyone with Excel can make and present a graph. No matter what the data is, it can be presented. But how that data is presented makes a great deal of difference. So if someone's making sort of general graphs, they can make a lot of mistakes, especially if they're not sure about the sort of principles of presentation. And there's sort of two sides to this. There's the formal side of actually knowing the correct usage of particular graphs. That's important. There's also the presentation side of not wanting to overwhelm your data with the sort of clumsiness and clutter of too many graphs or overburdened graphs. So, and in addition to these particular notions, as we'll see, it's also very easy to mislead with data through the presentation by either cluttering or using the wrong format, right? Or by using the format, but by drawing false comparisons and correlations. We'll take a closer look at that. A way that I like to talk about data presentation with students is by using and slightly bastardizing the paradox of Zeno's arrow. While we don't have time to go into the full lesson on this, a quick sketch of the paradox will suffice when we put it into the sort of data and presentation context. So the paradox can be, excuse me, the paradox can be summarized as a question of perspectives and narrative. The question is a flying arrow ever at rest? Well, the answer really depends on instance. At any given nanosecond, yes, but within a relative time scale, of course, no. This is a matter of perspective and scale, and therefore the argument, if presented misleadingly, can be made that an arrow that's loosened from its bowstrings is not in motion. We can make that argument depending on our scale. This is the danger sort of available to us. This is the trouble that we can make with the visualization of data. The wrong scale can greatly alter the data being discussed. And the same point could also be made about the nature of the arrow itself. If an arrow is being shot at us at just the right angle and we're head on, we'd only see the very tip of the arrowhead as it comes towards us. Taken from a different perspective, however, a different image of the weapon becomes clear. We have to keep these ideas in mind as we design our visual output for our data. How does the way that I'm representing the data obscure or clarify the central story of the data that it's trying to tell? So here's a classic example of storytelling. Despite the large amount of data being presented, now there is a lot going on here, but there is a clear narrative that emerges with a simple reading of this graph. While we could spend time going through all the details of the chart, what we could easily read is that the development of political parties in America started rather simply. All right, that's over on this end of the graph here. That these political parties, they started rather simply with Whig politicians separating themselves from the loyal Tories in the period leading up to the American Revolution. So that's at this very end over here, this very beginning phase right here, right? This then gave birth to the post-revolution parties that were fairly cleanly separated and well-defined. But that the antebellum period, which is a period right before the American Civil War, right? So we have this sort of stretch of time right around here. Things are pretty evenly declared. We can kind of see through this story arc two parties that are kind of separated. We see that in the way this is going. So leading up to the antebellum period of the American Civil War, we see a complex struggle for political supremacy. That's where we get into this entangled section here. And this leading, of course, to the American Civil War, which then again simplifies the political parties afterwards. So we have these moments of conflict demonstrated in this graph, right? In this entanglement, as you can see, this is the struggle for power here, right? It's sort of physically demonstrated through that. But then again, a return to sort of some amount of simplification, right? Just like we had up here. The narrative emerges through this chart, even if the data is dense. And that's the important part here. We have a lot going on in this graph. It's impossible to just read, right? But just by glancing at it, we see something going on that we can kind of discern. They clearly make something of a meta point, right? Something that sits above our graph that pulls us through this narrative, even despite the sort of nitty-gritty of the data and that it demonstrates. So this is much denser than we could just sort of look at, but we can see something. Through this little center part, we see the twists and turns and the machinations of these parties developing, but we have these moments where there is some sort of simplicity followed by moments of confusion that then turn into far, far, far more confusion. We have a narrative then of the development of political parties. We can see just at a very surface level what is going on. Clear these drawings. Okay. Now in this video, which I'm not going to show because it's hard to do that over Zoom cleanly, it kind of gets all jittery and weird. But in this video, what he's doing is demonstrating health outcomes over different timescales. And what he's overall trying to say is that despite the sort of complexity of life that we live in now, the overall sort of average age that people live and sort of the better health outcomes that are resulting from modern medicine and things have sort of generally improved life. So the basic idea here is that we're confronted with this paradox of perspective. So we tend to view a lot of the outcomes, and he's doing this in this example, we tend to view these outcomes through the lens of the present. So in other words, a long life in the first millennia versus a long life in the second are relative to their instantiated moments. So by measuring outcomes through a persistent lens and a present lens that only really captures the sense of longevity to its present understanding, we're missing part of the picture. So in other words, if we were to magically expand this chart a millennia forward, right, into the next millennia to 3021, perhaps this 200-year period that he's discussing where things magically get better, right, maybe that becomes completely irrelevant. It changes his story, right, but maybe also the story of human history. right? This blip where we live, where, sort of living to, 80 or something years old, that, in the grand scheme of things is this momentary blip in human existence where actually this expanse of life is much longer. The scale and scope are incredibly important to actually determining the accuracy of the data. This is, again, one of the dangers here, right? We could also make what is potentially valuable data completely irrelevant by expanding that too far. In other words, it may not be relevant if we're talking about this 200-year period where things have gotten better. Why would I include, data points that go back a millennia, right? Then it makes my data look insignificant despite the story that I'm trying to tell. So I could either make it irrelevant or I could kind of be overemphasizing a particular moment. Those are the two sides of how this can kind of go. Okay, so to simplify these notions, however, we can think about data presentation in terms of audience. The more sophisticated the audience, the more complex the data, right? Well, not really. The data still need to demonstrate the narrative in a convincing and accurate way. But the focus and the complexity of the data is what shift. So thinking back to our political timeline from before, who would you assume is the primary audience for this? This probably wouldn't go in like an academic publication, like a journal of the American Historical Association, or a sort of an academic book, sort of for the collegiate level, but it could very well sit in a textbook for 12th grade history or a museum or something like that, right? The accuracy of the data is not mollified by its simplicity. In fact, in some ways, it's amplified its accuracy. And these are intertwined to make a clear point. There's less room for detailed analysis, but that's the purpose, right? We want to see that generalizable and clear point. The purpose is to tell a story that is generated by the data, but it sits somewhat above it, right? We want to see the kind of outline in the sketch. We want to see the whole arrow, not just the tip of it. Now, if we look at some other examples, we can see how the presentation of data, despite its accuracy, can obscure the narrative. So, for example, here in this figure, we see a fairly straightforward bar graph that purports to demonstrate ticket sales trends. Right? Okay, that's all well and good. But while I can see some of the basic dips and rises kind of represented in this graph, I have to actually look at each number in comparison to actually draw any kind of meaningful inference. But let's compare this with the same data presented in a different graph. See, now the story emerges much more clearly. What I see from this chart is this sort of August split right around here, right? In the number of tickets sold and then the number of tickets received. Something's going on right around here. So this gives me an incentive to understand why. This tells me that there's a clear difference between these data points. And so now the narrative of what I'm trying to maybe explain to my boss or my board or whatever becomes a lot clearer. If I think back to this graph, if I presented this in a meeting, people would be struggling to kind of get the point that I'm trying to say. And my words would be essentially fighting my data. I would be trying to tell this story that, for some reason, we're selling more tickets and we're actually recovering, right? So, but if I'm looking at this data, that's not entirely clear. What I see are sort of some general dips and whatever, but it kind of looks like things are generally the same across this year. I don't really understand what this presenter would be saying to me if he's saying that there's some sort of discrepancy. But if I look at this, then I see, okay, then yes, in August, we have this jump where we are, there's 50 less tickets or so that are being brought back than we're selling. What's going on? What we want to know why. I don't know what this is sort of fun what these tickets are for, but you get the basic idea there. Okay, so let's take another example here. In these charts, I'm being asked a lot. As a reader, as somebody in the room, sort of absorbing this presentation, I'm being asked to compare relative percentages across two charts. A pie chart is usually used to demonstrate, a whole, 100%, and then the fractions within. Okay, well, that is what's happening here, but it's not quite lining up with what they're sort of showing as in a pre and post test here. So when presented with data such as this, like I'm looking at a focus group here, it's not telling me what I actually need to understand. Yes, 40% of the whole group responded a certain way, but what they're trying to communicate is the change. And I'm not really getting any indication unless I work really hard to understand the change. It's not that it's inaccurate, it's telling me the data, but it's doing so in a confusing way that's making it difficult to understand exactly what's going on. It's mixing up its colors a little bit between, it's not telling me exactly what I'm trying to get out of this. What we're trying to understand is a story, a change between these two, pre and a post test. We want to see what's happening to our group between these two. If we look at this bar chart, however, right, this is simple bar chart, but here I get immediately the difference between these two elements, right? I see that, how do you feel about science? I see that, there's not a huge change between bored, in the pre and post test. I see that they don't feel great about it. That hasn't changed very much, but I do see a jump here, right? I see a jump here. Okay, I see a narrative that's coming through this pre and post test, right? And the reason I can see that is because I'm looking at these elements as directly comparable. Here, I have to jump across and figure out and have to do the math to figure out what's going on. I'm not seeing an exact correlation between these two things. But when I do this, and I present them as right next to each other, I get a much better sense of what is actually happening in this data. Again, this is fighting me if I'm trying to present a change over time. If I was presenting this at a conference, say, or in a class, and I was saying, I did this research, and here's my results, I'm trying to say that these students felt a little bit better about science between whatever intervention that I'm giving. The readers, the people in the room, are going to have to kind of guess why I'm getting this information. It's not clear from this, but in here I can kind of point the way, right? I can show there's a general rise here that points some picture of my data, right? It's giving me even, as you can see, a way to kind of even show it with a line, right? I can show that there is a jump, there's a change. The story that the data tell are incredibly important to the understanding that a person will walk away with from the presentation. But we have to be careful. We don't want to obscure the data in favor of a nice chart and a convincing story. The story has to accurately and truthfully reflect the data. Obvious statement, I suppose, but when you think about the sort of demonstration of the data, we could have chosen different ways to kind of, blow out these lines by changing our scale, for example. That would have maybe accurately reported the data, but inaccurately demonstrated it. So this has been a tactic that we've seen even over the past, the pandemic crisis, of these, data being reflected by various different interest groups, the way that they want to show to emphasize a particular point that they're making. And this has real world consequences, of course. So here's an example of how perspective can distort the message. Also, there's a lack of sort of numbers and things like that obscures the meaning. We're sort of left to our best devices to figure this out. But the two different perspectives tell two separate stories, more or less. But we're given the same information. The narrative weight falls into the two separate areas with potentially opposite meanings, right? This is telling the same thing between these two charts, but the way that the weighting is emphasizing this information, just very simply by turning one or the other, we're getting a totally different story. This example here is also another one, and in a classic example of correlation doesn't equal causation, which I'm sure you've all heard over and over. And this is kind of taken to the extreme, but it's for illustrative points here. But we're presented with two sets of data, and we're comparing, STEM spending, science, technology, engineering, and math spending, and rates of a very particular form of suicide. But this is essentially a coincidence, right? These two things, while there may be some interesting ways to show how this data is related, is essentially not, right? But these two things both have these numbers, right? We can make this point by incorrectly and dishonestly proving through our data. Coincidence and misleading correlations are mainstays of conspiratorial thinking. And the presentation of false data in these types of arenas have become one of the most common types of misinformation. This is something very common. While both things may be true, these two things might be true, they don't really, they don't deserve to overlap in this. They don't deserve to be compared. These are two separate items. In other words, my enjoyment of oranges and my being from Boston are two true things, but they have nothing to do with one another. Right? There can be two things that align, but that don't actually relate. In this example, the valuable data is hidden by an overly simplistic model. Right? In other words, the display of one variable has hidden the rising costs across the board. This selective data therefore hides the truth in favor of a narrative of a singular argument. This is why it's critically important to understand both why narrative is important, but also when the truth is obscured by it. So being careful not to allow your argument to obscure the data. While it's true that costs, so in this example, it's true that costs in marketing have increased in this period, it's also misleading to say that that's the only thing that has increased over this period, right? By missing the general context in sort of figure 1 here, right? We're saying, well, here's marketing costs. They've gone all the way through the roof, right? And we see this huge rise over this period of time. But what's not being displayed are these other dimensions, these other areas that are also rising, right? So what we see by looking at this comparative data is that costs have increased, not just marketing costs. And this is one way, especially that a lot of sort of news media and things misleadingly present statistics, right? You've heard the expression lying with statistics and things like this. This is kind of how this tends to go, this sort of focus on a single narrative. And this is one of the areas to be both aware of when it's your own research, but also something to be mindful of when you're sort of consuming research as well. As a data creator and presenter, it's something to always be mindful of. Now, realistically, not every node and every every variable can always be accounted for. This comes partially from study design, which is not something we're going to get into, and sort of the multidimensionality of a research project and all of this. But it's something to kind of be careful of in drawing conclusions, right? And sort of making that very simplistic association that this plus this equals the answer, when sometimes it sort of just isn't as clear as that to make that argument. We see this again in hiding the truth through misleading scale. So here we see 2 points, or 2 examples of the same number of the same data focused around the same points over the periods displayed. The second chart exaggerates the change by making the incremental growth appear strikingly exponential or off the charts, which is just sort of not true, right? By collapsing the time scale or the point scale here, we make this look like this is a giant leap. When we do it more in a more nuanced way, right, we can present these changes like this. But when we make it as sort of a microcosm, we see this huge jump. Right? So it's only increased by 0.2 between these two charts, or these data points, whether you see the same dip here to here, but here we have this huge dip by expanding our time scale, or in this case, our sort of integers here. We're sort of expanding them to a sense where we're losing all sense of scope and reality. Overall, the basic notion is that we have to be careful when presenting our data, not to let our narrative obscure the truth, and not to choose a visualization that obscures that truth. So we want to find the visualization that best highlights our data for clarity. We don't have time to go through every different chart type and everything like this. That takes some external reading. And again, reading those books that I mentioned a moment ago help point the way towards that. But there are any number of books that you're able to find, or other resources about communication of data for different sort of research types or settings, business settings, so on and so forth, that help to clarify your data in the best possible way. But let's start with, I'm gonna do a poll, right? I'm gonna ask a question to you both, and then I would like you to try to answer. So I'm gonna put the question up here, okay? And I'm gonna try to launch this poll. This is maybe not gonna work. We'll try. I have 2 questions, so do your best here. 10 more seconds. Okay, well, I only got one response, but the one response was correct, pie chart, right? We want to show fraction. Why do we want to be able to do this? Well, unlike that other data that we show where we wanted to show like this, even this presentation can be a little bit confusing and may not show. In this case, what we're seeing is a sort of change over time, right? And that's good. If we wanted to know, for example, for this one, if we wanted to say 2007, zoom into that year and to find the percentage of spending in a particular year, then that's how we'd want to present it. Okay, let's try 2. Oh, we already have an answer for 2 somehow. I think that might have been a mistake. Anybody else wants to answer? Okay, 10 more seconds. Okay. So what type of chart would I use for comparing 2 variables to each other, right? To make that comparison between one area and another in the most accurate way, to make that direct connection. We want to use a column chart like this with comparison variables, right? We want to see these 2 things compared directly next to each other in order to make sort of the best guess at how to interpret the change between these 2 things over a given time. So in this example, we would see, let's say, our points, right? We see how this team did, period 1, period 2, and we can compare them across. So not only can we make comparisons, on this sort of small scale, like down here, right? We can compare these 2 to each other. We can also compare these 2 as a set to these 2, right? And we can also compare these internally, right? We can make all of these different comparisons across and can show that in our presentation in a way that's very clear and easy to understand. Again, we want to make sure that our data is simple and easily comparable. Okay. Other types of charts, for example, if we, let's see, which one number I'm after? Okay. So for this one here, right, we have our sort of simple variables. This would be to check, the sort of frequency of a particular variable, particular node, that sort of a thing. This would give us a sort of basic understanding of a sort of progression between these things. Same thing with these, right? We would want to see how these variables are, and we can develop our time scale, whatever our scale is, in order to make those connections. For something like a box and whisker plot, this is where we would want to display many variables, sort of the sort of range within a particular answer, say, or a particular response, and where those fit next to other variables and other answers. And we'd use a scatter plot to tell a story of correlation and a kind of general smattering of where the data lie, right? So in a plot like this, what we can really see is sort of the range and scope of particular answers and where they fit on a sort of histogram, or where they kind of fit, in relation to others. So we use each one of these things, and of course there's many more, but we use each one of these in order to present a different form of data for a different reason. Goodness, okay. So this is just a sort of general end of the statement here, and it's of course important to know that data and data sets are not objective. And what this really means is, on both ends of the sort of data collection process, the data that we choose to collect is of course not a neutral process, and neither is the process on the display side. But our goal is to try to make meaningful connections between the data and our presentation, and to try to establish a narrative that is sort of clear, concise, and honest in the way that we're presenting this data. So this next, okay, I don't know where those slides popped in from. I just want to talk briefly. We're already kind of coming up on time ever so slightly. So I want to talk very, very briefly about data collection with an eye towards presentation. So not an overall discussion of methods and all of that, but just a kind of basic snapshot on some of this here. So this comes from a workshop that I also run on data collection and storage, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but it's important to kind of establish, even through the last bit of our discussion here, what is data, right? So it's sort of an obvious question, it's true, but we can kind of create data from any given thing. So it's just, for our example, let's just take something kind of silly like this. This is a basic Google form where we can create a simple answer, right? So let's just say this is a survey that is sent out to every student at University of Maryland. We can have what we think is a fairly basic, dimensionality here. We have yes, no, don't celebrate, won't be celebrating this year. But what we can see fairly quickly is that even with basic tools, we can get these sort of basic presentation tools and things going. But even something like this, based on our previous conversation, is somewhat misleading, right? We see this presentation of the data as, this kind of collection of the whole, but what we're really not seeing is sort of this sort of spread of responses. In fact, if we were to really plot this data honestly, we would probably want to do something more like a scatter plot. So we get some sense of where these nodes fit within this graph and where the sort of scope of the responses fit in. And more to the point, if we were to be designing a better survey, we'd probably be able to give some nuance to each answer and maybe use our box and whisker plot in order to give a range of different answers. So a yes might be a yes, I'm ready for Thanksgiving, but within that answer, we may ask sub-questions that then go to the point of, yes, I'm ready to celebrate Thanksgiving, but here are the complications of why I can't. For example, over the past year, maybe people weren't able to travel because of the pandemic, things like that. So to get some sense, not only of this kind of simple answer, but the sort of dimensionality that falls within it. So multidimensionality of data is essentially, and this is an oversimplification, but it's essentially the structure of data and metadata and other associated components that contextualize the analysis of a particular data node. So again, sort of extra features about that Thanksgiving question, something like this. In other words, it's the package of data that comes along with a seemingly individual data point. Now, the language around this is a little tricky because in different disciplines, the exact same notion of data are a little different. But to avoid confusion, we're just going to kind of take that as our basic idea. It's a package of data and then the other things that kind of create it and surround it. So if we have data point A from our silly little survey, we can see that 10 people responded, yes, they're ready for Thanksgiving break. But we don't really see anything else. However, even just a basic export of this data, this is just Google Forms. This is as simple as it gets into Google Sheets. We have some data added automatically without any effort. So it's not thrilling. This isn't fascinating information, but this timestamp data does allow for further analysis beyond just our original data point. I can compare the time entered for the various results and create analysis which may indicate people's readiness for Thanksgiving. If they, it's middle of finals, or it's not quite in finals for Thanksgiving, but right in the middle of, right before Christmas break, sort of midterms, assignments due, that sort of thing. And it's 2 a.m. when I'm getting all my responses. I can see that maybe people are ready for a break, right? And so things like that can be kind of interesting to include into my multidimensionality. Again, it's the package of the data and the way that things kind of add to each other to create something more interesting. I'm not going to go too much more into that, simply because I don't think it's sort of necessary. But again, we have our variables that kind of branch, and that's the important thing to consider with this. But what I'm kind of getting at with this, and I'll kind of end on this point instead of going through more of the slides, what I'm kind of getting at with this is that despite the depth of dimensions that we can have, we want to still remain clear in what is being presented. So just because we have the data doesn't necessarily mean that we need to display every last bit of it for our charts, right? If we had displayed every bit of this data, potentially we would end up, with these kind of overly complicated charts or the ones that may ignore certain features. So we have to be careful about what the data is, what it represents, and how it's being connected to our story in an ethical way. Okay, so I think instead of going much further than that on those particular points, since we're kind of near time anyway, I'll stop and see if there are any questions, and we'll go from questions if there is anything else to look at.